Good morning. So, first of all, thank you so much, Barb, for that introduction. Thank you so much, Dr. Blackwood, for inviting me to speak today at the symposium. I'm honored to be gathered with so many individuals who are interested in finding about lessons and recovery from all sorts of aspects of disaster preparedness. I'm honored also to be grouped with such a series of speakers. I am very interested in their professional and personal stories associated with their recoveries and their experiences. So today, I'll sort of leave it a little open. I want to make sure everybody can hear me, first of all. Is there anyone who can't hear me? Obviously, that's a pretty hard question to answer if you can't hear me. But if everyone can hear me, great. So I'll leave it a little informal today. I'll open it for a little question and answer session a little bit afterwards. And I'll be available all day for personal discussions and questions. Each of the stories that I think the speakers will be going into, and each of our experiences personally with disaster recovery and emergency response, a lot of times are personal issues, but it's important as first responders and professionals in these arenas to remember that we're also individuals who have a series that we have to go through and deal with as we treat those that we are called to treat. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about 1214 and Sandy Hook. That's how we characterize the Sandy Hook school shooting. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience, our plan associated with emergency response, the impact associated with my family personally, with my organizations that I volunteer with, my faith community, the organization of the state response, the federal response, and the local response. And I know I'm going to try to capture that all in a presentation, which is very difficult to do. And I know a lot of this will be probably focusing on some of the things that you really want to delve into with lessons learned, but it's also a little bit about understanding how this type of incident can directly affect the responders and the individuals that it impacts. So, unfortunately, this is how most of us were introduced to Newtown, Connecticut. For most of us in our own communities, this is the last thing that we really want to witness on any day of our lives, which is our community shown on the news in a response to something that is happening. Although most of us prepare most of our lives for dealing with these types of issues, when it finally does happen, and it's an aspect associated with your personal life, it brings in a whole series of different levels of exposure. So the town itself is situated in Connecticut, in New England. It's your typical small community. It has all the things you would think your small community would have. Your parades, your streets, your villages, and ultimately the celebrations that your community would typically have. And it has the homes and your families that you know and enjoy. So the town itself is just over 30,000. It's in Fairfield County, which is in the westernmost part of the state. It's about an hour and a half to 2 hours outside of New York, depending how fast you drive. It is a home rule state. And sometimes when I talk about the Sandy Hook and disaster preparedness, a lot of times I have to kind of go through the process. I had the pleasure of meeting Barb at one of the training sessions in Emmitsburg, Maryland for FEMA and for emergency management. And one of the understandings in most of the nation is that emergency services is by county. In New England, it's by a region or by a municipality itself. So in Connecticut, we have 169 municipalities. So we have 169 separate emergency management plans. We have 169 separate response teams. We have 169 for the small state of Connecticut. So it is repetitive in a lot of ways. So we try to divide that up by regions. We decide not to follow the county border. There's no county government. So a lot of what you'll see in the response process is not just unique to Connecticut and the individual town that I'm from, but represents how the New England Region 1 FEMA handles its emergency management response. So it's a fairly small town, annual operating budget about $120 million, and we have 5 public elementary schools throughout the town. Then we put them all together. We have an intermediate school and a middle school and a high school. We do have some private schools also, and they're K through 8, and there's 3 of them in town. So leading up to that, and I want to talk a little bit about disaster preparedness and response and recovery, because I think a lot of it has to do with the timing of where 1214 happened in our community's history. Leading up to the 2010 time frame, it's been fairly quiet in the Northeast, give or take your ice storm or a small blizzard. We really hadn't had a big blow from a hurricane in a while. And we had a series of events starting around 2011 that sort of put our community on notice for what it should be prepared for. And it came in a series of windstorms and superstorms and freak snowstorms. And I put this description on here because I wanted to make sure that as the EOC would operate for each of these, the Emergency Operations Center would operate for any of these different situations, our community became exposed to what it needs to do in an emergency situation. So the odd day of going without power because of a bad thunderstorm went into, we first lost in Irene in 2011, which was a summertime storm in August. We lost about 90% of the town, and we did have to evacuate some areas. So we had our first real stretch and exercise of our emergency operation plan that we had in a few years. And almost immediately afterwards, we had a freak snowstorm, which exacerbated the situation that we were in, which basically put us at almost 100% power outage for, in some cases, up to almost a month in town. And this sort of placed everybody on notice and heightened awareness that as a community sometimes we have to go beyond what our daily lives would hand us. And of course with Superstorm Sandy, it was almost kind of like, well, we've handled this before, we can kind of move on with anything. Well, we had, at the same time, we had a first selectman, which is our mayor, elected a few years earlier than this, and she became a very good cement for how our team was acting and our community exposure to how our team was going to respond in emergency situations. And finally, the blizzard that we had post 1214 just shows you that almost immediately with these types of things, it was almost kind of like, oh, okay, so we're out power for another 2 weeks, that's fine, we'll just kind of make do with what we have. And that just shows you the sort of tempo that the town and the community had gotten used to. So as far as emergency response in the town, we have the PD, which has 78 members. We have a volunteer ambulance corps, which has 50 members. With a permanent paramedic on call at all times. We have 5 volunteer fire companies, which average from approximately 90 members all the way down to 30 members with a different apparatus to support those organizations. I've been a member of Sandy Hook Volunteer Fire and Rescue for many years, and the firehouse itself, it just happens to be centered in Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook is a village district within the town of Newtown. Newtown itself is about 60 square miles, and Sandy Hook makes up about a quarter of that town. And the school and the fire company are within the center of that village district. We respond to about anywhere from 700 to 1,000 calls a year, depending on the number of storms. And we do have a major highway corridor and rail service that comes through the town to respond to those also. So I put up this picture. This is from my GIS system, and I highlighted the 2 properties that I'm going to talk about today. Unfortunately, most of us are probably familiar with this picture. We have in the uppermost portion the firehouse and a dead-end drive that runs along the left-hand side of it to the Sandy Hook School. Now, the Sandy Hook School itself is basically, and this is one of the lessons learned, is basically at the end of a dead-end road with no other egress or ingress to the structure. It's pretty easily described as one of those 1950s elementary schools, single-story structure with sort of a donut with a courtyard in the center construction. So I'm going to go through exactly how the incident unfolded for myself and for a lot of the first responders and for the school itself. So December 14th was a sunny day, and it was fairly mild comparatively. I work at the Municipal Center approximately 1.5 miles away. And I put these series of events down because I was one of the few responders who actually wrote down the incident as it occurred and unfolded. It's interesting how a series of training and what you pick up from your experience professionally will kind of be called forward in a process. I think that's so important. Train early, train often. I know it's a mantra that a lot of us hear, but it's so important later on when these situations come up because sometimes you're just going to go into autopilot. So sitting at my desk at approximately the time of the school shooting, I do have a radio for all response for PD, for EMS, and for fire, and understood that a call went into the school as a school shooting early in the morning around 9:30, and the officers that were dispatched almost immediately placed what is called an all call. Now, a little bit of the background of that is that we do have a process for emergency response where you put out an all call, and that basically calls all the members of that regime, whether it's PD or EMS or fire, to be situated and released by the dispatch. So after the dispatch call came in and an all call came out, dispatch would have then asked for more support for these different areas. Now, I know it seems a little easy now to be a Monday morning quarterback and look back at the process of the shooting during that day, but you have to remember the fact that shots were fired at a school and the fact that you had anything more than a disgruntled individual is very hard to fathom. So the fact that someone was shooting at the school was simply, everyone still was in a state of, it's an individual who is upset about something, or someone has a gun or a rifle at the school and something is happening, but everyone is safe. They're just trying to figure out what exactly the situation is. So at that point in the morning, I had received a phone call. I had understood that there was a shooting at the school, but I hadn't been dispatched yet. And I know professionally a lot of you understand that self-dispatching and self-deployment is one of our #1 no-nos in what we do. So it's at this point that I sort of think to myself, well, what exactly am I going to do with children at the school? So part of my thought process was that I have to listen very carefully to the situation. Well, my phone rang at that point after some people had come into my office. It had only been a few minutes, and it was my wife, and she was calling. Excuse me for a second. So it was my wife. She had come to the school early that day to provide my son with some stuff that he had forgotten. I had a son that was in 3rd grade and twins that were in kindergarten. And it wasn't unusual for one or all of them to forget most of what they were supposed to have that day. So the fact that my wife had left early to drop something off was not unusual. But the phone call came in, and my wife had said that that she was at the front door of the school, and that that someone was coming to shoot her, and to take care of the children, and that she loved me. So each of us understands in that moment how you have to place yourself in what the response should be. So of course I said I loved her, to be safe, and the phone went dead. So at that moment, the call went out for Sandy Hook Fire to be dispatched as medical response. So I have a vehicle, and I think it's very interesting to say that I don't think I truly remember going to the incident, but I can say that I remember coaching myself to respond to the incident in the best way I could, to be an individual to facilitate what I could do to family, friends, and to the school into what was happening. So it's an interesting study in responses to those who are serving and have personal interest in the emergency response. And it comes to play in some of the story that I'll tell. Excuse me. When I got to the scene, as I've described before, it is a dead-end road. I was one of the final persons to arrive on scene before it was closed off. So the time frame was that after the all-call, different things were happening at the school. Students were escaping. There was a lockdown that was occurring. There was an understanding that there was a danger still to students and to staff and to the people possibly responding. Within the time frame that I arrived, we had reached a point where we believed the scene was safe, but the school was still in lockdown. There was no understanding at any time what level of the shooting had occurred. In fact, when I responded, there were approximately 24 police officers of all different disciplines, state police, off-duty officers from other towns that just happened to be driving by, town police, NCON, which is our environmental police officers for the Department of Environmental Protection. So all law enforcement that had the ability to respond did. EMS had been dispatched and had been staged at the fire department, because at that time we had only had 2 individuals who had been transported that we knew were alive. And they wanted to triage if they felt there were going to be more at the scene and keep medical away from the potential exposure of the shooter. The fire department had its rescue engine, which had most of the triage equipment in it, available to us, so we moved it down the road and it arrived on the scene the same time I did. We had approximately 8 firefighters who were medically certified, the chief, a few officers, and then some other self-dispatching paramedics who were in the area, who were just standing around. Other than that, the scene was secure and everyone was kept at the firehouse as they arrived. So as this all occurred, we still weren't sure what was happening and how many shooters there were. We had different reports. We were asked to stay in a safe area on the other side of the parking lot. We had the first evacuation of the school within about 40 minutes of the shooting. We still weren't sure if there was a second shooter. There were different reports about people that were surrounding the area. It turned out later that they were interested parents and individuals who were concerned about what was happening and were trying to get to the scene to help out. My wife and a woman she had just met that morning, but has now become a fast friend, had been at the front door to bring my son Daniel some books and some materials for school. The school itself has a foyer that you walk through. It's glass. It is locked and you have to be buzzed in, but it's viewable from the office, although the office window is opaque, and so you can't really see who's out there. You'd have to look at the camera. When Barb arrived on the scene, she actually saw some children running out of the parking lot. And this is where I want you to take a step back. The first thought that she had was, well, that's interesting. Why are they having the kids run so early in the morning? And so she really didn't comprehend what was going on. And when she parked at the scene, she saw the car out front with the doors open, and it was in the fire lane, so she thought to herself, well, you know, I'm going to tell Rob about this. Someone's parking in the fire lane. So the next thought she had as she walked up to the doorway with the glass all over the ground with this other woman that was there, they looked at each other, they said, well, someone's going to have to do something about this. Someone's throwing rocks at the glass. So you have to understand that that you can't process these situations as they approach you sometimes. And this is not unusual. I've heard this in other descriptions of responses. It wasn't until they thought what they heard were fireworks going off in the school. As Adam Lanza approached in the hallway, they realized that what was going on, and they fled the scene. As they ran, he simply chose not to shoot them. When they ran to what they thought was cover, which is right around the corner of the front door, it ended up being a 1,000-gallon propane tank. So my wife's first thought is, I think Rob would be very upset with me if I was hiding behind a 1,000-gallon propane tank. And you have to understand the humor in this is that this is one of the few ways that my wife is able to cope with what she had to witness and hear that day. Unfortunately, as she hid, which was not very far away, she became an audible witness to the Sandy Hook school shooting. Within the next 15 minutes of that and a police officer arriving, she was moved and ran to some trees not too far away, and there she stayed until I arrived. So at that point, after the shooting had stopped and the first evacuation began and I had arrived, no one had actually left the school or the grounds. I have the happy circumstance of being the first family member reunited with another family member that day. Having my wife come to me and meet me in that parking lot was one of the more salient experiences I have ever had. But the following, right after that, was what topped it. I'm fortunate enough to be a fire prevention officer for the fire department also, and had spent the better part of a decade running fire prevention at the Sandy Hook School. That year, in October, prior to it, the principal took it upon herself to ask me to come up with an off-ground evacuation plan, and had come up with the process of evacuating the school to the fire department in case there was an emergency that necessitated it. So I realized as soon as I saw Barb, the next thing that would be happening is that the students would be going right past me to the fire department. And I had the second happiest point, which was having my child come up to me and realizing that they were safe. It is moments that are dragged out now to hours and days and weeks of your life that you can describe and kind of fall back on and say, what happened at that moment? Again, it is important to recognize that I had a pad of paper and I was writing down what was happening at any one moment. You know, preparing ourselves for what was to be what we thought a mass triage. The second evacuation of the school didn't come that much later after the first evacuation. They just wanted to continue to make sure that the school had been swept. As the time went by and different units became available to us, we recognized exactly what we were facing. I'll never forget being able to process or having the information to be able to tell our first selectwoman what actually had happened, and the incomprehension of processing that information and is nothing less than heroic on her end. So, yes, we moved everyone to the firehouse. We moved the apparatus out of it, and the bays became the ability for us to treat and triage the students that had escaped. We had numerous runners that had just raced out of the rooms to survive. We had also had many that had been part of the lock-in-place procedure and had followed their teachers out. They were in the process of identifying who was missing and who was present. The confusion associated with that is expected. We spent the better part of several hours after the emergency services were released and the PD and law enforcement and the crime processing system became present to really get all of the kids out to the different parents at that point. Unfortunately, the firehouse also became the notification center for the families and next of kin, for the teachers, the educators, and for the children that were killed that day. It is always a surprise to me to have conversations with other folks who have been in situations where the body and the mind and the psyche spend time calculating and comprehending and coordinating the information that it's processing. And it's an educational experience to talk with those people that are at the same point that you were that day, because it fills in a lot of the gaps, because you are only your one individual processing the information that you see in the best way that you can. So in the afternoon, we had most of the federal alphabet soup arrive and begin to process the scene. Not only did you have the notification to the families that were going on, which included not only political components associated with it, but the professional services that were necessary for any of the victims' families. So some of the things that happened that day and some of the things that happened immediately afterwards are now common practice. The fact that cell phones, not only through texting and through phone calls and lockdown situations, became a conduit of information for the safety and for the clearing of the school. Now that's almost a commonplace sort of practice, and we've built into our operations plans, emergency operations plans, and school security plans that cell service is almost a necessity within any of our educational facilities nowadays. Again, the recognition of the facility itself, that it had not undergone anything other than a buzz-in for the foyer entrance area, which was more for the cold in the winter to go through double doors to help with the heating process. And one day someone just said, well, let's put a camera on it and put a buzz on in case someone is really disgruntled and has an issue, not thinking at all that the glass that was between them and the individual, as simple as taking a punch and being able to go through the actual glass itself. The necessity of a mobile EOC and being able to place and move your assets associated with what is necessary, whether it's town-wide or specific within your region of response. It was interesting how, at the time, it's easy to go back and critique a lot of the responses in the different disciplines. It was amazing the amount of communication that happened at any given time. I felt very informed, and I felt, unfortunately, overloaded with information almost consistently for the better part of four to 6 weeks. It is the location of the fire department happened to play a very significant role in Dawn, who was the principal at the time, who was killed that day. Her foresight associated with the evacuation plan, which again is something that I'm sure all the principals of most educational facilities, of course, think about, actually made a difference that day to the exposure that most of the other children would have had if that hadn't been in place. Part of the process that we're pretty familiar with is, just, quickly being able to understand who is a victim and who isn't. And then, of course, the public outreach and coordination immediately after this type of incident. So within the first first week to 4 weeks, beyond the official statements and beyond the shock and the 1,000-yard stare, we had to process as a community what had happened. There seems to be, unfortunately, sort of a dance that happens after most of these events, where there's a recognition of the loss, there's an outreach associated with it, and then there's a processing of it at a public level, and then there's a processing at a community level or at a personal level. So a lot of what the first responders were categorized as, you were either, because of the exposure, and a lot of the first responders that were there that day had been exposed at some level to 9/11. So had an understanding of what the process would be afterwards with crisis intervention and debriefing associated with it, not only as for those who were there that day as a crime scene, but also for individual traumatic counseling. The media. So unfortunately and fortunately at the same time, while I was on scene, I was coordinating some of the emergency response by text to my other deputy directors in EOC and to other resources throughout the town. I had decided at that point that I would set up the media response at a neighboring park so that I could keep the media away from the scene. And so we began to set that up almost within hours of the shooting. The unforeseen circumstance of a community where your individuals are responding to it wear many hats, which I'm sure all of us understand and know, is that the chief of the fire department also is the emergency management director. He also happened to have a family member in the school which they thought was killed during the shooting. Was notified of that within an hour of the shooting, and at that point became compromised within the command structure. So it's difficult, again, to really comprehend how these kind of command structures, the response, the traumatic situation is all going to be happening all at the same time. So during that day, I not only became the husband, the father, and the officer of rank for the fire department, I also started wearing the emergency management hat. Until, of course, Chief and I had a talk and we were able to kind of get to a point where we understood where our roles should be. The following few weeks saw the better part of all the funerals locally. So it continued the shock and the recovery process of the community as each child was buried and each educator had a service. It reinvigorated the emotions that each of us were feeling that day, and whether it was a parent who had a child at the school, whether it was a parent who had a surviving child that escaped one of the rooms, or whether it was a child that was a parent of a victim or a family member of a victim, of an educator, each of them brought their own level of grief and process and their own process that became public for us to deal with. The pilgrimages to the memorials, I put that in there because I think a lot of us have seen this over the years, and probably some of the other speakers will talk to this. It becomes almost a homage to the victims to be able to go to the site. And I think it's something intrinsic to each of us individually to be able to experience or stand on the ground or be near in order to reconcile perhaps what has happened. So we to this day have daily visitors to the school and to the fire department to recognize the shooting. I can say with certainty that the President's Vigil was the first moment within the 72-hour period that the community sort of turned a corner. It's interesting that, and being a first responder for a lot of years, and some to a larger events, that you would need a moment to have everybody stop and be at the same place again to sort of reset your emotional and psychological button. And it was important to have our communities of faith be a very much large part of that, along with our public health services. As we all began to recognize that curve of recovery, which was shock, and then denial, and again we go through our steps associated with it, it became very clear early on that the individual journeys would be processed, and that you could be talking to one person who is very comfortable with the event and the situation almost immediately, and another person who was still there that day and still processing the situation. So it was, again, very individual, but the amount of outreach that we had in the different organizations, everyone really had an ability to find a different coordinating system for them to be able to have some way to release what they were processing. But again, everybody wanted to be recovered immediately. But again, the recovery is very slow. And again, it's the level of exposure has something to do with it, but also your background. So it does require assistance. No one can do this alone. I really want to reiterate that. It is truly, I think, and a lot of times our disciplines ask us to be able to come up with coping mechanisms that sometimes we no longer have the tools to be able to deal with. I want to tell you it's important for us as responders, planners, and any of the different tools that we use professionally to remember to be able to reach out, and that it is not a form of weakness, but it is actually probably a form of strength. Again, the continued reminders that happen, whether it's a plaque, a balloon for our birthday, a celebration of life, an article in the newspaper, a sticker on the back of the car. Each of these can be triggering mechanisms for an individual. And it not only becomes a psychological and emotional response, it becomes a physical response in a lot of ways, which continues to this day. And as our community recovers, we get to see those manifestations in different ways. So one of the things that you see those in those physical manifestations is in the abuse of alcohol and drugs, divorce rates, the siloing of individuals in the community process. On the other end of the spectrum, you see the opposite. You see the embracing and the exposure to more public for what they feel is something that they can take good out of a terrible event. So a lot of the community lives in a layer of grief and exposure to the disaster, to 1214. And I talk about walking on eggshells. There's almost a palpable line between an individual who lost a loved one to those who had an exposure that changed their lives, to a first responder who may have been at the scene, to maybe a parent of another child in another school. And each of those is granted an allowance of grief. And it's important to recognize that everyone processes these so differently that even the person who may have had their child in a lockdown in another school may be dealing with a level of grief or trauma that may be similar to someone who may have been a surviving runner, but still has to process that. I have a young girl who unfortunately was one of the few survivors in one of the classrooms who has a burn mark on her forehead, where the muzzle was placed. She hid under her classmates. And she's a very courageous young girl. And that, when you see the symbolic representation on an individual that is worn, facing us all the time, I think it's important to remember that we carry those within us for each of our responses every day. So one of the things that we did to kind of move beyond those points is to rebuild. I was honored to be selected to guide the location for the new school to be built. It seems an unusual process for a community to dispose of an institution which was part of their community for so long. But there was such a gravity associated with the situation that happened there that day that the state saw fit to help fund the replacing of the school, which was at the end of its usable life to begin with. It had had a lot of different changes over the years and was in big need of vast repair. So we went through a public process to identify sites within the municipality and narrowed them down over a 3-month period. We welcomed the public and all the elected officials within the town to be as a community group to help figure out where the next spot would be. It held no true regulatory authority, but it guided the community in its first steps to rebuilding. So when the new school, when the situation was that we would knock down the old school and rebuild on the old site, it was a relief, and it was also a reminder that we would be dealing with this tragedy and with this situation for as long as the community would be around. So we do have a new school now. We also have new support organizations. We have dozens of nonprofits that have risen from this event, that have had great impacts in the community and beyond. And we have had town infrastructure that was affected by the event. And I think that's important to say. The town infrastructure itself was affected by the shooting because a lot of times we don't equate an all-hazard event or a human-made event with infrastructure being affected. This is the school. I have the thrill of having my children attend the original school, the temporary school in the neighboring town, which was gifted to the municipality for the better part of 3 years to be able to have the students attend while the new school was built. And my boys were the first 4th grade class in our school. It is a testament not only to the strength of the community, but also to the vision of the individuals affected directly and indirectly by 1214. So, just a picture of some of the children, and what I want to wrap up with is that each of us really does carry with us the events that we have to deal with in our professional and personal lives. Emergency situations will and do happen. Disaster preparedness is necessary in the fact that it presents itself in ways that we could never imagine. So I'm happy and thrilled that you invited me today to speak and to share some of my experiences. I will make sure that I'm available for any personal discussions, and I want to just sort of open it up a little bit for question and answers if anyone has any. If not, I'll speak privately.
Any questions? Sorry.
I see that there's a long time between dispatch and PD and EMS and fire. Was that common then, and is it still typical now to have that big of a time difference?
Well, because of the active shooter nature of it, the PD did not release the scene safety. And the responding individuals at the time had to process that for the responders. I think as time has gone by and after actions have been done on it, I think each of us understands the necessity to best place our assets, whether it's ambulance or fire, for what is occurring at the time. Because we didn't understand the scope of the scene at the time, I don't think the officers were prepared to give a dispatch for emergency services at a level beyond what had already been set out, which was 2 ambulances.
What kind of support is mental health support?
If you hold on just one second, because they can't hear you in the back of the room.
What kind of mental health support was available for the victims and the responders after the incident? And how long did the process go?
So the question is, what sort of services were available to the victims and the responders? You know, there were so many. I could probably say that there were probably 100 different organizations offering some sort of support, whether it was a professional support group through the insurances of the employees, whether it was state, military, whether it was hospital and regional public health, whether it was professional organizations. All of them brought their assets to the table and made them available. I know that, and I'm not speaking out of school for my fellow brothers and sisters in the fire department, but I think one of the most telling moments for the fire department was the next day we were toned out to respond to the fire department to all be in a locked room to discuss the moments and have counselors available to us and to feel in a safe environment. I think that's one of the most powerful moments for recovery that I think each of us had afterwards. And I think the individuals who were given to us as a resource were present there, basically helping to line the room and give support. Whoever you felt most called to, whether it was a house of faith or a professional organization or the state or military, they were all there. They were approximately there wandering around in the streets with the military and the folks who went back and forth to the fire department. The fire department was used as the main center of dissemination for all things for the better part of 2 weeks before it started to calm down.
I was interested in the conversations and decisions that were made when you were planning and building the new school, as far as physical security for the school.
Mm-hmm. So the question is the security and the process associated with the new building. So not too later on, the following year, we were invited, a few of us, to go to Washington to look at some of the building requirements for federal facilities and the link between educational facilities and public facilities. There was a publication, I won't even begin to tell you what number or alphabet is, soup to tell you what the publication is, but there is a publication out for secure institutions for educational facilities that is put out by the feds. And so we were tasked for looking at that, and we were tasked for making the new Sandy Hook School not only personally tasked as a community, but at the state and federal level, with having this be sort of a model to go by, which is, it's a heavy lift for what we were asked to be doing in the first place, but it was a necessary lift because the personal experience was not unique in the Sandy Hook School, unfortunately, and that process that could be retrofitted to other schools could be used in the new construction. So I'm happy to say that the school continues to be a model for other communities throughout the nation and the world to be able to use to understand approaches, safety, different types of safety glass, visual corridors, lockdown procedures, notification procedures, for all of the things that you would hope would be an education facility without losing the ability to educate and have the individuals going to it to feel like it's a secure and caring environment.
We have time for one more question.
Rob, thank you for sharing your story of a beautiful family. I was just curious if you'd let us know how your family's doing now.
Thank you. Yes, although I try hard to stunt his growth, my 13-year-old has topped me in my height and is had probably the most direct exposure besides my wife. Unfortunately, a few bullets did stray into the classroom. They were safely placed with the unbelievable foresight of the teacher. He is on the spectrum, and so he has a different way of processing some of the events that happened that day. I draw a lot of strength from how he deals with it. The twins have an exposure that is very different. Their exposure is mostly through their parents' processing of it. I think they probably have had more of an impact on how Barb and I have spent the better part of our years in that day responding and understanding that their friends were the ones that were lost. But they're doing very well. Thank you very much for asking. Thanks again for inviting me. Again, I'll be available to speak to anyone throughout the day, thank you.